A trillion-dollar company just raised the price of your laptop by $200 and called it a flood. Not a metaphor. Tim Cook actually told investors Apple hiked prices because it's living through a 100-year flood on memory pricing with exponential increases. That's the kind of sentence that used to come from oil executives, not the man who sells you a phone. So, what is actually going on at Apple right now? Because depending on which headline you read this week, the company is either quietly falling apart or quietly winning. Both stories are true. That's the problem. Start with the corner office, because that's changing too. Tim Cook is stepping down as CEO on September 1st, 2026, handing the job to hardware chief John Ternus, in a transition the board unanimously approved after what it called a thoughtful long-term succession planning process. 15 years at the top, $4 trillion in market value. He's not being pushed. He's walking out on his own terms into a bigger office with a fancier title, but he's also walking out in the middle of a mess he built, and the AI number is the one that keeps analysts up at night. While Google, Microsoft, Meta, and OpenAI are pouring more than $100 billion each into AI infrastructure, analysts expect Apple to spend just over $11 billion this year. That gap didn't stay theoretical, it showed up in Siri. Apple previewed a smarter, more personal Siri back in 2024 and advertised it heavily around the iPhone 16 launch before quietly admitting the features weren't ready and pushing the whole thing back. The delay ran so long that Apple ended up paying a $250 million class action settlement over the false advertising claims, with eligible iPhone owners able to claim up to $95 each. $250 million spent not on the feature, but on apologizing for promising it too soon. Now picture the other bet nobody talks about anymore. In January 2024, Apple strapped a $3,499 computer to your face and called it the future. 2 years later, the company had sharply cut both production and marketing for the Vision Pro amid weak sales, with its Chinese manufacturing partner halting production entirely. Estimated sales fell to just 45,000 units in the holiday quarter of 2025, down from roughly 390,000 in the device's 2024 launch year. Even Cook eventually admitted, on the record, that it was never built for the mass market. So, slow on AI and a headset nobody wanted. That's the bear case. Here's where it gets messier because the courts are involved too, and not just in America. Apple has spent years fighting Epic Games over the App Store, and it's losing ground. A judge found Apple in contempt in April 2025 for willfully violating a 2021 injunction meant to let developers steer users to outside payment options after Apple tried to preserve its cut with a 27% fee on those external links. The Supreme Court agreed in June 2026 to hear Apple's appeal, meaning the company that built its empire on control of the App Store is now arguing its case to 9 justices, with billions of dollars in commission revenue on the line. Apple isn't fighting from a position of desperation either. The company points out that the App Store ecosystem facilitated a record $1.4 trillion in total billings and sales, arguing developers continue to thrive globally even under the current rules. That's the tension in a single sentence, a company insisting its system works beautifully, standing in front of the Supreme Court because a judge already ruled it doesn't. Cross the Atlantic and the story repeats itself with different letterhead. In April 2025, the European Commission found Apple non-compliant with the Digital Markets Act and fined it 500 million euros, giving the company 60 days to fix the violation or face escalating penalties. Apple appealed. Brussels rejected the appeal in September 2025, and by early 2026 was still holding Apple to a full compliance deadline covering everything from third-party app stores to non-discriminatory device pairing. Apple's own regulatory filings acknowledge the stakes plainly. If the commission ultimately rules against it, the fines could reach up to 10% of the company's annual worldwide net sales. 10% of Apple's global revenue. That's not a parking ticket. That's a number designed to change behavior. And the App Store fight isn't the only place Apple's playing defense over control of its platform. Rave, a cross-platform watch party app, filed its own antitrust suits after Apple pulled it from the App Store in August 2025, citing unspecified allegations of fraud and vague concerns about content moderation, the kind of vague justification that fuels exactly the walled garden criticism Apple's been fighting for years. Every one of these stories points the same direction. Late on AI, a flopped headset, a courtroom loss in America, and a fine in Brussels, it's still trying to undo. Developers accusing it of moving goalposts. That's the screwed up version of Apple, except the actual numbers refuse to cooperate with that story. In the second quarter of 2026, usually the slowest stretch of the year, the iPhone grabbed a record 20% share of the global smartphone market, even as worldwide smartphone shipments fell 4% year over year. In China specifically, the market Apple was supposed to be losing, iPhone sales rose 23% in the first 9 weeks of 2026, while the broader Chinese smartphone sector contracted by 4% over the same stretch. Apple did it by refusing to raise iPhone prices even as component costs exploded, absorbing the pain instead of passing it to customers. That restraint has a limit, and Apple just hit it. A global memory chip shortage, driven by AI data centers eating up DRAM and NAND supply, pushed contract prices for standard memory up an estimated 55 to 60% in early 2026. In late June, Apple raised prices across its Mac, iPad, and Vision Pro lines by as much as $200, citing higher component costs. Cook wouldn't say whether iPhone prices go up next when the foldable and iPhone 18 Pro launch this September, but most analysts already expect they will. Even the workaround has a catch. To secure supply, Apple is reportedly in talks with Chinese memory makers CXMT and YMTC, companies that face US sanctions and trade restrictions, pulling Apple straight into the center of a geopolitical fight over technology transfer. US senators have already pressed Apple for details on what technical information it might be sharing with CXMT, warning that the move could undermine billions in planned domestic memory investment. Solving one crisis just opened the door to another, and instead of retreating from any of this, Apple is doing the opposite. It's making its biggest hardware bet in years, right in the middle of the shortage. The company is preparing at least 5 new iPhone models between late 2026 and mid-2027, and has raised its production target for its first ever foldable iPhone to roughly 10 million units, up from an earlier forecast of 7 to 8 million. Total iPhone production for 2026 alone is expected to exceed 220 million units, marking the company's most aggressive product release pace in recent years. That's not the move of a company that's given up. That's a company betting its balance sheet can outlast a supply crunch its smaller rivals can't survive. And there's evidence the bet is working. Apple's scale and purchasing power let it secure memory and components more reliably than Chinese rivals like Xiaomi, Oppo, and Vivo, all of which have slashed their own annual production targets below 100 million units. The shortage that's supposed to be hurting everyone equally is quietly widening the gap between Apple and everyone chasing it. Wall Street's noticed, analysts have pointed to the foldable launch, Turnus taking over, Apple's record install base, and double-digit growth in services as reasons to stay bullish on the stock. So, which is it? Is Apple the company that lost 2 years to a Siri delay, paid a $250 million settlement for it, and is fighting 9-figure fines on 2 continents? Or is it the company holding record market share in a shrinking industry, using its cash pile to outmuscle a global chip shortage that's crushing everyone else? It's both, and that's the actual answer, uncomfortable as it is. Apple didn't screw up by standing still. It screwed up by betting its caution would be free. It wasn't. The Siri delay cost real money and real trust. The Vision Pro cost billions in inventory nobody wanted. The App Store fight is now in front of the Supreme Court because Apple tried to comply with a court order in letter only, not in spirit. And in Brussels, regulators have made clear they're prepared to keep escalating until Apple's business model actually changes, not just its press releases. But none of those mistakes touched the one thing that actually keeps Apple at $4 trillion. People still buy the phone. In a quarter, when the entire industry shrank, more people bought an iPhone than ever before. That's the part the Apple is doomed headlines keep skipping past, and it's the part the Apple can do no wrong headlines use to skip past everything else. John Turnus doesn't inherit a company in free fall. He inherits a company that's still winning the one battle that pays the bills, while quietly losing several it swore it could afford to sit out. Whether he can close those gaps before the next shortage, the next lawsuit, or the next AI product cycle catches up to Apple is the actual question. Not whether Tim Cook screwed up, but whether the company he's leaving behind screwed up on borrowed time. That's WTF is going on at Apple. Not a collapse, not a coronation. A company betting that being the last one standing is worth more than being the first one there.